share.
Perfect. Okay, so people are still joining, but in the interest of time, I'll introduce you so that we can start off. Okay, so welcome back to the Stanford Classical Liberalism Seminar. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Anat Admati. Anat is a professor of finance and economics here at the Stanford GSB. She has earned numerous awards for her research and contributions to finance and our understanding of financial markets. Anat's work has also made a profound impact on our understanding of banking regulations and financial stability. She's a public intellectual, perhaps best known for her advocacy on the topic of banking regulation and her co-author book, The Banker's New Clothes, What's Wrong with Banking and What to Do About It, which explores the need for fundamental reforms in the banking sector to reduce systemic risks. Today, Anat is here to speak about capitalism, laws, and the need for trustworthy institutions. Welcome, Anat.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This is the title of an essay I wrote. I'll get to the essay later and what triggered this essay, and that's the title I gave it. It was a volume on capitalism. And so I talk about these kinds of things right now. But how did I get to be talking to you about capitalism? I'm just a finance professor. I was just interested in governance before. Let me just get this to advance. We just tried it before. Okay, so that was virtually exactly 15 years ago. This headline is from September 16th, but the 15th was the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. And that was a big shock. And there were all these different failures, and there were unbelievable actions by governments and central banks all over the world, and in particular in the US. And so here you see some of the participants, some of the headlines of those days. So this is tomorrow is the 15th anniversary of September 15th, 2008. After looking at a bunch of the stuff people said, I co-authored a little essay, a little teaching note called Fallacies, Irrelevant Facts and Myths, and just put it out there online, because we just started hearing, and then Martin Hellwig, who's a German economist who's been more involved in banking, was telling us three Stanford people what some of there was being said we had to counter. So a lot of nonsense of the three different types. Fallacies, completely false statements. Irrelevant facts, true, but not irrelevant to the debate. And myths is just models that are true on their assumptions, but the assumptions have nothing to do with the debate or are not inadequately applied to the debate. I was not aware of this quote, but this brings you to the politics. Banks are the most powerful lobby, and they frankly own the place, said after the financial crisis, a senator in an interview. So we wrote this book, and I'm bringing two quotes. I see that John joined us, so I made sure to quote him. I need certification for this audience, so I'm getting it from two of some of the participants that come sometimes to these workshops. Gene Fama gave a blurb to the back of the book. John Cochran reviewed it for the Wall Street Journal, and they seem to think we have to say something, except Gene Fama, when I sent him an advanced copy of the book, said, why is it so simple? And why is you babying the reader? And I'm like, did you ever talk to these people? Do they understand anything about what these words even mean? So then you had to take them by the hand, and so you're invited, if you're not an economist or a finance professor, you're invited to go from your mortgage to how leverage works, to what's a corporation, all this stuff, to all the details of capital regulation. So that was 2013, paperback 2014. After the book came out, I heard in another book on the politics of banking that Paul Volcker said to a senator at some point, anything you want to propose, they'll always claim that credit and growth will suffer. It's all bullshit, he said. So that's another way of saying flawed claims, fallacies, nonsense, the kind of words you might use, okay? BS. That was fact-checked with him. So here are just a couple of little examples just to get you into my world. This is a statement from somebody in Financial Services Roundtable back in 2010. Every dollar of capital is sucked out of the economy. That's nonsense. In 2015, same playbook, a different guy, ex-congressman. The rule will keep billions out of the economy, also nonsense. After the book came out, so this is also after the book came out, the CEO of the bank in which I had my money said, because we have substantial self-funding, he called it, with consumer deposits, we don't have a lot of debt. So he kind of forgot that my deposit is actually a liability to him, a legal liability. So that's how easy the money is if you're a banker. So he thinks, it's just play money to him. And I still didn't take my money out until recently, where I took it out to First Republic, and I'm in Chase. So this is crazy. And he's not paying any interest. So that's just crazy. Anyway, where are we? So my was like, you forgot. So we had recent crisis again. So as these crises were happening, we were trying to wrap up a crazy project, which again, John and people familiar with this will know why it was so crazy, which is to write it was supposed to be fall 2023 edition of our book. What happened in COVID, how they bailed out everybody. And, now we have inflation and high interest rates. And all of a sudden it was due March 15th. So you can imagine it was a few hectic months to try to update it. And now it goes all the way to May, including First Republic. So it now has like 200 extra pages on top of the old ones, which are completely irrelevant, just updating. And we explain a lot more about central banks this time. So we explain what a central bank is and how it can create this money and print this money and how it interacts with the markets. We're not doing monetary policy. I'm not going there. I said I live a full life without ever talking about Phillips curve or any of these things. So no monetary policy, no interest rate policy, just how the central banks interact with governments and with private sector institutions and markets, and how they can bail everybody out because they want to, and they can, and they'll tell us it's all for us always. We also talk more about law and law enforcement, and are concerned that some of these people are above the law, especially when you get to be too big to fail and nothing will ever happen to you. I'll touch on that a little bit. And in general, whatever we were complaining about that we don't know the truth, it got worse. Right now, where it's post-fact world, we're debating about fact. So the power of truth got less in the political discourse. So we have a lot of noise and all of that. That's a concern for society. So a student of mine proposed another title, but we didn't choose it. What's still wrong with banking? We told you so, all of that, but we chose just the same title with the red ties for the people walking naked. This is clipped this morning. As I speak, I hear the same things again, and I'm so depressed. So, John, I'm going to need therapy for the fact that they're now saying, growth will suffer. You won't be able to loan. If I didn't pay a dividend, I couldn't lend you. I mean, it's depressing. Same thing. 15 years later, same thing. So the essay on which they were asking, the Oxford Review of Economic Policy asked some, 15, 20 people, mostly economists, the question was, what's gone wrong with capitalism? What needs to change and how to fix it? Of course, the problem presumes something went wrong. And so people had to struggle with that, and we only got 5,000 words for it, including old-fashioned references. So you see, it's a tall order. And so I advanced a thesis that if you read it, it basically says that the forces of this capitalism as practiced have basically created a crisis of democratic institutions. And they now we have an intertwined crisis of capitalism and democracy. I'm not going to talk here about democracy, and democracy is not in the title. I talk about institutions, and there are institutions of democracy and there are institutions of the economy. I'm an economist, so I'm going to talk more about institutions of the economy, but the government is important here, obviously, because it sets some rules and it has power. And I also talk about deception and the manipulation of beliefs distort both markets and political systems. So they can sell you a product, they can hype, a startup or they can confuse the politician. That's all in the persuasion, potential deception space. So the world is composed of institutions, and I divide them to nations, state. Of course, there are other governments and corporations, especially global corporations, but also a lot of local corporations. Some of these corporations have global presence and engage with lots of governments, okay? So our lives depend on institution. There would be the private sector institutions. They include all the corporations, all the businesses, the nonprofits, the media that are kind of considered private sector. Then there's all the governments all around us that we're somehow have to deal with, that have, charge us taxes, do things. And then there are some global institutions, they don't touch us very much. They are much softer law, whatever. So James Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So, the notion that we don't need government is suspect. And of course, in the US, in the Constitution, they want to constrain our government. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So now let's go to, in the essay, I said, okay, what do even people mean by capitalism? So I went to the dictionary because there's a lot of throwing around that anything that involves the government is socialism and communism and totalitarianism and all this stuff. And I hate that debate, and I hate those false dichotomies and false choices. So one definition is a way of organizing the economy, so things that are used to make and transport products are owned by individual people and companies rather than the government. So it's about who owns the means of production, private sector or the government, which basically defines capitalism as not socialism or not totalitarianism, not government control. So socialism is then defined in contrast as a way of organizing society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individual people or companies. So that's the contrast, okay? Now, in these definitions, you don't find, markets and, it says companies. So it does have companies, corporations in the private sector, but basically it's about ownership. And there's no mention of markets, competitive markets, or anything else about freedoms or economic freedoms, other freedoms, whatever. Okay, so it doesn't go to politics at all. It doesn't go to regimes or governance of government, okay? Now, I want to introduce you to corporations, these companies, okay? They have a very interesting history. I was always in corporate governance, and I was thinking that corporations just owned by shareholders and the rest is agency problems and contracts and competition and all that. Well, the history is that they started as basically government-chartered, government-like entities with monopoly power doing things that government usually do, like conquering lands and using violence and having armies and all of that. So they're the ones that went to East India, and, the English East India conquered India and only later was taken over by the government and closed. And we had obviously the original one, which is the Dutch East India, VOC. And there was a legal innovation there that I'll mention in a second. Eventually, still in the end of the 19th century, before the government started taxing a lot, didn't have the means, it was just organizations to build infrastructures, and they would be chartered for specific purposes and collecting money from investors and then doing the infrastructure projects. By now, because we don't want the politics of who gets the right and who doesn't, we have what you might call free corporations. You go to Delaware and you become a corporation. So I'll show you about that. So the key features of modern corporations, very importantly, is that they're abstract legal entities. And I'll talk more about that. They are separate from all human beings at all. And they exist in the legal space. They're abstract persons. They're created by governments, by some law. In the US, it's by state law, often Delaware law, which is sort of it sells corporate law, basically. It has courts for that, to adjudicate some things related to corporate governance, to share boards and shareholders and all of that, some contracts, like whether Musk should buy Twitter or something. governed by law and charter. So they create a charter. They say, I'm here, I want to do some legal stuff. And then they become a corporation, potentially even anonymously. But importantly, corporations do not emerge in the natural world. No state, no corporation. In other words, you need the state, and I'll talk some more about that, in order to enable corporations to exist and get all these rights that they get. So they exist by governments, they get legal rights from governments. So they have property rights. Obviously, the corporation owns, not any person, not even the shareholders. The shareholders have rights in the law, but they don't own the assets. The corporation owns the asset. The shareholder funds are locked in. If they get a dividend, that's by decision of the corporation. Limited liability is something that was added later so that we can trade the shares. In the US, they get more and more and more rights in the courts. The owners say, I'm religious, I don't want to obey this law, and the corporation gets the right not to obey that law. They get speech rights, some rights that the Constitution didn't quite envision who quite gets, but they say we should get too. Obviously, due process, all of those things. So, state of Delaware has almost more corporations than people. In some city, apparently in Delaware, they wanted to let corporations vote. Usually, they don't vote in elections, but they can impact democracy too. Anyway, most of these can be anonymous. You don't know who the beneficial owner is. There's a lot of debate about that, about secrecy. So the corporation is separate from everybody, and there's this corporate veil that separates the corporation. I can't draw an abstract person, but has headquarters, has maybe some building. Some don't. Some are just shell corporations. They don't have any economic activity, no employees. They just exist for secrecy. So that's a whole other thing, and we have no visibility to them. So you can't drive the car down the road being completely anonymous, but the corporation can be completely anonymous, buy a lot of apartments in New York, all kinds of things like that. So they evolved from quasi-government institutions to legal person in what we call the private sector. And then the veil separates corporations and their stakeholders from each other's obligations. So if the corporation owes something, no stakeholder, is touched by that. Their personal assets, okay? They're shielded from that. And similarly, the corporation cannot enter it doesn't pay a stakeholder's debt except through the governance mechanism. And it's sometimes in economics, they say that it's a nexus of contract, but this structure, especially the legal separateness, is not replicable by individual contracts. There is a discontinuity there towards the existing. There's some interesting books about corporations that you might read. I'll be happy to share these slides. This is about corporations in the US, We the Corporations. The Anarchy talks about the English East India. This is about the evolution of corporations in Europe and in the trade. If you have institutions, you need to talk about governance. Governance is about some really, really big words in the language: power, information, incentives. Okay, that's what governance is about. And if you're going to have good governance of institutions, all institutions, you kind of need to have trust. You need to have the ability to commit to not harm the other people who depend on your decisions. And you need to have, it kind of got messed up here, accountability. Okay, so somehow we have to be able to hold accountable the people with power to make decisions for an institution that affects us, okay? Whether it's through democracy, through, I don't know what, revolution, through the law. So what can we trust? What makes us trust anything? I argue that obviously effective rules can build trust. If there's a law, I can have access to the courts and I can be sure, or there'll be a policeman who'll stop you if you drive too fast. And we have different names for the things that the government writes that are rules, basically. And then private sector writes all kinds of rules, and you can they go from contracts to charters to all kinds of standards. We don't have any rules about speech, so Facebook will decide, or X will decide what's allowed, what's not allowed, who can come in and who can come out, and then they have to enforce it somehow. So that's all in the space of rule writers, okay? But every rules, even Constitution, which is the biggest commitment of society to something, need somebody to say what it means and somebody to enforce it. So that's true for all rules. And this is a cartoon that says these rules will fundamentally change the way we get around them. So people try to get around rules if they don't like them. So that's called regulatory arbitrage, or maybe innovations in finance. So we take for granted that there is property rights, but even those are kind of human-made things. We used to allow people to own other people, but now we don't allow that. And you know, you need to allocate those rights, whether it's to, you know, temporarily to the plane seat you bought or something else. So I'm just saying this is adjudicated often in the court. This is a trade dispute about NFT and whether these images belong to Hermes or to this made-up Birkin's NFT, and it goes to court for private litigation that was adjudicated in the Southern District about whether there's copyright that need to be paid by the creator of this a non-fungible token to the people who created the real bags that have a trademark on the Hermes bags. Just an example. No rules, no markets, says Tariq Fancy, Chief Investment Officer for Sustainable Investor at BlackRock, ex-former, who wrote a series of articles calling BS on ESG and sustainable investment and all of that. And what he says too is he gives a sports analogy, which I also like to give about rules. It doesn't make any sense to say the government is intervening in free markets anymore than it says that the NBA is intervening in the game of basketball. I know Jeff Zwieba likes basketball. To put the three-point line someplace. In other words, somebody sets the rules, and then there are referees that enforce the rules. And here is our own Golden State Warriors not happy about a ruling. And there are implicit rules, of course. Some rules are formal, some rules are social norms, ethical norms, etc. So there are all these dichotomies between markets and governments, but again, you can't have the system we have, corporations at scale, contracts, markets, without an infrastructure that's legal. And then it starts mattering who writes these rules, how they get written, how they get enforced, all of that. So there's a lot of institutions around the system that kind of make it work that we all need. Markets and much more depend on competence and integrity of the government. It's not as much about the size, but it's really about the competence and the ability of legal systems to kind of give us the infrastructure we want. In the discourse, sometimes people like the rule of law, but they hate regulation because the word regulation has a bad rap. But they're all rules written by government. There's some mechanisms that are different about who does what and who enforces what. For any rules, when you say that it's costly, what do we mean by it's costly? Who benefits? There's enforcement cost, there's compliance cost, of course. You know, it's costly for me not to be able to steal from you, but we decided that people don't steal your money, okay? Does it balance the social costs and benefits? So that's somehow what it's about. Well, of course, we have to decide how to balance that off. And is it a good rule or is it a mess, okay? Which a lot of rules are a mess. Milton Friedman said on governance of corporations that the social responsibility of managers is to make as much money as possible. I mean, he didn't say what that means. In finance, we say that maximize the stock price. In accounting, they might talk about, or in practice, they might talk about earnings or return on equity or something like that. But he added, while conforming to the basic rules of society, so here refers to rules of society, both those embodied in the law and those embodied in ethical customs. But overall, the essay is very drippy of a lot of hostility to the government, even though somehow some of these, you know, bureaucrats that he's speaking very derisively of are going to have to enforce those rules of society. So that's kind of, you know, a little bit of a contradiction there. If we unpack the dictum, everything is fine to make as much money as possible. That means shareholder value, people translate it to things. So shareholders agree that that's what they want, making as much money for them. And the rest of the people, you know, the markets are free and competitive, that he says free and competitive markets without deception and fraud. So in the end of the article, he kind of operationalizes what he means by, you know, operate under the rules of society. Free and competitive markets without deception and fraud. So he's presuming that that's going on. Somebody will make the markets competitive, and somehow there won't be deception and fraud, is the assumption. And that everybody but the shareholders has contracts and the laws to protect them. So if there are externalities, the law will protect. And otherwise there will be contracts and all of together they will work, so that would be what you should do. And you don't have to worry about things people can give to charity, and all of that can play out, but the manager should focus on making as much money as possible. But what if shareholders, may not like what the corporation is doing somehow? Okay, so maybe they might give up something. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not really in favor of, really going for shareholders for everything. But what if governments fail to write the right rules? And so then people don't feel protected at all by their contracts or by the law. More importantly, what if the corporations actually affect the laws and their enforcement? And what, in fact, if that's the way to make money, is to impact the law with no consequences for the managers? Now, what if making as much money as possible, therefore, involve violating or changing the rules of society themselves? So now you have endogenous rules of law, and saying, take the rules of law as given and just make as much money, no longer works in that case, because they're making as much money as possible involved interfering with the law. This is an example where recently corporations say more about legal rights or gay rights or whatever, woke capitalism you might call it. And Mitch McConnell said, don't talk about voting rights. You're not designed to talk about politics, but do send the checks. That's okay by him. One example is Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma is a private corporation, there's still some nonprofit. There are many books about Purdue and the Sackler families. They engaged in all kinds of persuasion. They persuaded the FDA to approve a certain writing to OxyContin. They persuaded doctors and the public about pain medication. They especially persuaded everybody that OxyContin was not as addictive as it actually is. And many people benefited from this system. There were distributors and pharmacies and regulators and doctors, and some doctors are in jail now for pill mill and all of that. And meanwhile, the Sacklers are donating a lot of money and laundering their reputation, all of that. Now the company filed for bankruptcy. The settlement of the bankruptcy itself, which gives an immunity to the Sacklers from even civil suit, is before the Supreme Court because it was struck down. Yes.
So there is a question by John Cogan. Do you want to postpone questions, or are you willing to take
what's
some?
The question?
Well, I had one in context.
Yes.
You're saying that corporations maybe should do other things for stakeholders.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that law should work.
That's great. Law should work, but the call is that governments have failed.
Yeah.
So corporations should do something other than
this is a debate.
But that always involves, my word in life is no passive verbs. So what it always involves is governments should force corporations to do something else, which,
That's right. So governments have power over corporations, but, the question is, what do they use the power for? If they use it to, regulate the banks and force them not to pay a dividend, maybe that's for the benefit of society. So, the issue is just what's a good rule for society. Society includes all economic actors, citizens, and corporations alike. So, so there's rules that are set for corporations. Some rules are written just for corporations, like antitrust or whatever. But or what rights they have. The question is, what's their responsibility in the law? Because they were created for lawful practices, or what's the law? So that's the question. Now here, the law is that they have to get FDA approval, right? They have to get FDA approval. They got FDA approval. They convinced the FDA that because it was slow release or something, that it wasn't addictive, but that was just false. They didn't have any evidence for that. And so it was all legal, except, later it was called misbranding. Okay, they deceived. So there was a certain law that they broke. Nobody went to jail. Some executives were charged, actually. But that's the question. After what they did, and other manufacturers and distributors and other people and pharmacies, a lot of people suffered. Now, if you as an individual caused harm to people, they will sue you, and maybe depending on what you did and how you did it, the government might, if you drove recklessly in the street, you could go to jail for a year for manslaughter. So, there are things that you can do, but when corporations do something with a certain outcome, the question is what What do you have in the law to, you know, to get accountability, to get justice, or to prevent it from happening again? So that's a topic that I'm very interested in, corporations and the rule of law right now. The fact that I was drawn back into banking is sort of depressing. But anyway, let me just conclude. I'm not an ESG person. I'm not a stakeholder governance person. I'm only asking the following: if the government is failing, did corporations and rich people do something to make that true? Did we rob the governments? Did we corrupt the government out of their ability to do what they need to do? That's my question. Okay, that's what Durbin was saying. They own the place, the banks that just caused all this havoc. So here's the banks. They paid a lot of fines, but they made more money. So that's cost of doing business. You pay the fine, you move on. Okay, so if it doesn't deter, then okay, we have to live with the consequences. Now, there was a famous book that was written and then a movie after the financial crisis. Michael Lewis obviously wrote a lot about sports and about the finance. And the epilogue of the book, The Big Short, funny book, but kind of serious, so was Liar's Poker. He kind of reflects back on his Liar's Poker, and he says from the moment in 81, when they sort of basically Salomon Brothers became a corporation, that's when it became a black box, and the people whose money was put at risk didn't understand the risk, and the managers took over. So that's about manager shareholders. But what he says about the financial crisis is kind of nuanced, and is sort of what we're saying, is that it could have been prevented if there were better rules, and it can be prevented again if the rules were improved, and it's not. The problem wasn't that Lehman Brothers had been allowed to fail. That's the event 15 years ago. The problem was that it had been allowed to succeed beforehand, that it got to the point that it could implode and cause all this collateral harm. The movie, The Big Short, ended differently. The movie ended by why nobody went to jail. That was the end of the movie. And then people went to jail, not. But most of what was in the movie and in the book was legal. So there's not going to be jail. And Michael Lewis in a book put his hand on it, which is the rules allowed Lehman Brothers to be there. And then the same governments bailed out everybody. So when the corporations come with the law, this is one book by a legal scholar called Too Big to Jail, which is all about corporate settlements. Federal prosecutors benefit from statutes that allow an entire firm to be held liable for a single employee. That's why Stanford wants us to not break the law, because they might be liable while we're on the job. But when prosecutors target big corporations, they often are at a disadvantage by just the cost of litigation and all of that. So a lot of the agencies are attacked in the courts, and there's a lot of power in the corporations and in the executives, because it's very hard to connect higher ups to wrongdoings in the corporation, even crimes that were committed sort of by the corporations. A book by a judge that also was a prosecutor, was 17-year defense lawyer of corporation, recently said in the US we imprison, he knows a lot about science in the court, and he was on committees to discuss evidence in the court, but most of the legal things that happen in the US don't happen in courts actually. In the United States, we imprison thousands for relatively modest crime, but almost never prosecute rich, white, high-level executives who commit crimes having far greater impact. The system convicts innocent people on the basis of dubious forensic science because they settle because they don't have good legal representation and shaky eyewitness testimony, and sometimes even coerces them into pleading guilty for crimes they never committed. In stark contrast, business executives appear increasingly exempt from criminal prosecution, even when they commit very serious fraud. So I'm going to finish in like 2 slides. I learned a new word this year. It's called agnotology, the making and unmaking of ignorance. It's by historians at Stanford. It was published in 2008 as a book. And recently in May 2023, there was a conference, 15 years later, a conference in the history department to which I went. And the whole idea there is, what don't we know and why don't we know it? What keeps ignorance alive or allows it to be used as political instrument? Agnotology, the study of ignorance, provides a new theoretical perspective to, but this is from the blurb of the book, broaden traditional questions about how we know to ask why we don't know what we don't know. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I actually have a copy of the book now. I'm going to wrap up by this. Lucas, an economist, famously said, when asked, what do economists do? We're storytellers operating much of the time in the world of make-believe. It's the only way we found to think seriously about reality. So he's saying, and I'm a theorist, so I understand about making reality in a model and proving some math. So storyteller. So the question is, what happens when we look out the window with our stories? In the real world, right now, there is a lot of unfocused anger, and there's a lot of noise. Then the anger can be manipulated. The anger can be directed at the wrong targets. And that's what I'm concerned about. So I just want to leave you with a question of what is it that we might do about it? How can we, fight ignorance? How can we bring sensibilities to political discourse? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anat. So we'll open it up for questions. I see that Jeff Twibble has a question. Please, Jeff, go ahead.
Hey, Anat. So you didn't touch directly on this, but the title of the talk was Trust in Institutions.
Trustworthy.
I'm sorry?
Trustworthy.
Trustworthy. And many institutions in the U.S. have suffered a great loss in trust in recent years. And at least I would attribute that first and foremost to the politicization of institutions. The Justice Department, the SEC, schools, corporations, the FBI, I could go on and on. These are institutions that have all lost a lot of trust, and one main reason, I would say the primary reason, is because many people see these institutions as having been politicized, and frankly, that the politicization of these institutions seems to be a primary goal of the Democratic Party. So, so I want to ask you: do you see this as a problem? And do you, I often have in our conversations and debates have seen you supporting the policies that I think lead to the loss of trust in these institutions.
Okay, so let me say the following. You took already a partisan view, and I am.
I think a partisan view is appropriate here.
Okay, so let me say something about politics, okay? Politics is how we make collective decisions in a democracy, okay? So I don't know about politicization, but, we have political institutions, and we have the government institutions are supposed to have some checks and balances. There is a legislature. There are different things. There are different people in various bodies that are of the government that get elected through mechanisms that you might or might not call democratic, through electoral college and all kinds of other mechanisms. And the states have their powers in this country. So different nations have different structures of democracy. So that's why I didn't really want to go to democracy, because it's a very complicated topic. But I don't see politics as a dirty word. I see politics as how we engage. So my going to banking, I had to confront the politics of banking. The politics of banking is bipartisan, and I tell you that I read a book. Right now, you can go and read it. Of course, you won't agree with some of his conclusion. I just read it. It's called The Crisis Wasted, and it was by somebody who was in the Obama White House and blames Obama for the Trump election. Okay, I mean, Obama hired all these Clintonites, and they bailed out all these banks, and people got angry, and then Trump came along. There are lots of things that we can discuss over the lunch table. I don't know why, the decisions have to be made. Different people support or not support. In the political discourse, Senator Sherrod Brown, in the issues that I'm debating, the Federal Reserve, with chairs coming from both parties under Ben Bernanke, who's a Republican, wouldn't engage on the issues. And even though they had the perfect authority to do what I wanted, it was a law proposal by Vitter and Brown.
Anat, I'm sorry to jump in, but you've completely sidestepped my question. Are you concerned with the recent politicization of institutions? And do you think this has played a big role in the reduction of trust of these institutions?
No, I think what I'm concerned with is corruption is what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with an abuse of power everywhere. Okay. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, said somebody. Okay. So I'm only concerned with corruption. Yesterday, I listened to a podcast again about the law, because I listen to those things all the time. And it was about, I think it was actually Bloomberg Law, where there was an ad by the Bank Policy Institute about the Supreme Court and whether the Supreme Court itself, whether it can or cannot be regulated by and the trust in the Supreme Court because of corruption scandals about, favors by people and people not excusing themselves, even though somebody gave them a big favor to interview them in the paper, whatever. Point is, the Supreme Court here can adopt its own ethics rules about what they can and cannot accept from people coming before them. I'm concerned with corruption, abuse of power for private gain.
I just want to quickly, on a point of fact, no one has accused the Supreme Court justices of corruption. None of the favors that they received were from people who had issues before the court.
That's not true, actually, but we'll take it about. That's not exactly true. Okay, but yeah, it's not corruption. It's just okay. Are you saying that it's okay? We should not require any disclosures. That's all. If they can say we are committed, all of us, to disclosing personal favors we get, and we are committed to recusing ourselves if somebody who gave us a favor recently comes before the court. The Supreme Court.
There is no charge that a decision the Supreme Court made was in any way influenced by these favors.
We don't know that. We do not know how decisions by Supreme Court are influenced. The question is the appearance of conflicts of interest. That's all. Maybe not, but should the Congress people be allowed to trade on information they got during secret information, insider trading laws? Should they commit to not trading on information they get? They often enrich themselves, both parties.
Okay,
both parties are corrupt. What can I say? My husband says this to me all the time. Let's not have a democracy. Democracy is corrupted. We have wise people controlling us. No, I get into the Supreme Court thing. I agree, Jeff, that institutions have lost trust. Okay, I agree with that. But I think that it's because they're not delivering what people want. That's why. And some of them appear corrupted. Sometimes money in politics is called corruptive dependencies. Okay, you need the money to be elected. That's just the system we have. Money is voice. That's the system. Do we like it? That's the system. Jamie Dimon has more power than me. That's a system.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yes. So I know you're not a stakeholder, governance person, but I still want to ask an ESG question. I don't know if that's okay. So it seems to me that stakeholder capitalism today is a very popular idea, and this, according to its advocates, it's aimed at creating more trustworthy corporations, right? So essentially, what worries you? I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that under this paradigm, firms are expected not just to comply with the laws, but also to advance a specific notion of the common good, right? Typically summarized by the ESG movement. And underlying this idea, it seems to me there is this notion that firms have a stronger social responsibility than individuals. Individuals are expected to comply with the laws of the land, but they are not expected to advance any specific notion of the common good. So I wanted to hear whether you agree with this, and more generally, so what are your views about this movement, its promise and also its risks?
Look, we all are supposed to obey the law. And the question is, what if I have a lot of money and I can really have a lot of impact on the law, do I use it for that purpose or not? As an individual too. Some individuals have a lot of money and they can also influence the law personally, individually. Okay, it's very hard for individuals to get rich outside the corporate context, but then they get paid and they have it themselves personally. So the influence on law is by now. Corporations just control a lot of resources in the economy. They often have more resources than many governments. So the question is, who does what and who's responsible? Now, going above the law or beyond the law is something that is in this ethical space that you might say, if there's a gap someplace in the law, so I'm not getting what I want from the government, so I'm going to ask somebody with power to help me out. Okay, so that's what, Disney employees wanted the CEO of Disney to speak about, don't say gay or something like that. There were employees, they felt like they were harmed by this law and they wanted somebody to speak up, and that somebody was the person with power that is in their corporation. And of course, then he gets into this ridiculous fight with DeSantis about, some subsidies they got and he's going to take them away. I mean, I'm agnostic about, all of that, but it's crazy. Okay. ESG. I took out some slides because I knew I had too many. So talk is cheap. Right now it's a mess. We have, no measurements of any of this. Who's going to enforce what? Right now, California wants to demand that you disclose things. Disclosure is costly too. I'm not a regulation hawk. I just, I'm against a lot of the financial regulation, actually. They're just so wasteful. They don't go for what's really most bang for the buck. So my debate was, how come the most obvious thing you don't do, and instead you do all these complicated things, 10,000-page living wills and all sorts of liquidity rules we don't need. I mean, a lot of crap you can get rid of if you just did if you just had the upside and downside in the same place. So, I just think it's kind of a mess, and I kind of lament that the government is not delivering, and that's why our democracies and our, are eroding somehow, or I don't know, we can't make them do what we want, and it becomes so noisy and so dysfunctional. I mean, sometimes, sometimes I look at China and I say, at least if they decide to do something, they can do it. I mean, we're so dysfunctional over here, we can't get anything done. So that requires joint commitment. The ESG people, the bleeding heart people come to me and say, oh, I'm going to go to these CEOs and tell them to pay more than minimum wage because living wage or whatever. Or localities try to do living wage laws, okay? Because people can't afford to live here or whatever. And I say to them, if you go to a CEO and ask him to sign for blood that they'll pay more, but the competitor is not paying more, I mean, they can't commit to you because it's competition. So the way we commit together is through the law. That's my view.
Okay. Josh?
Thanks. Thanks, Anat. Very interesting presentation. We were talking just now about ESG and stakeholder capitalism and things. I have a bunch of thoughts about that and read Milton Friedman a little differently, but for that, I think maybe we could just postpone discussion of that till I give a CLS talk later in the fall, because I don't think that was really the sort of key takeaway from your talk. The key takeaway that I took from your talk is that you provide a lot of examples of violations of ethics that companies did that were mostly legal. And then
illegal, but nobody paid a price for it. They paid a fine, but it was not
okay. And then there was the logical sequence was, okay, so like, therefore corporations are corrupting the government, and therefore we need to give the government more power in order to limit that. Is that not what you're saying? That's not.
So I'm sorry if that was the impression. What I meant to say was the following: we want sort of a rule of law. And the law has to address, society's needs for balancing powers, for avoiding abuse of power, for avoiding, harms that we think are actual harm, for preventing people from causing other people harm. In other words, people have freedoms and people have rights. And how do we balance that when, your freedoms interfere with my rights? That's the question that we have to solve as a society somehow. And so somebody gets a power to control, police and prisons, and that's the government. you can get the government to, you can get the government corrupted. It's not necessarily corporations, but it's potentially, people with a lot of resources to do it, because it takes resources, which is why I spoke about both sort of the need of governments of money and elected officials of money, and a way to persuade them, which if you have access for them, you may be able to more persuade them. Now, they can also avoid you. I had the experience of being avoided by Ben Bernanke himself. I mean, this is wouldn't talk. Do you know, I'll tell you something privately. Ben Bernanke, who was my colleague here at Stanford, who then tried to hire me at Princeton, when he was Fed chair, he would not talk with me. He talked only to people who wanted to advance a liquidity narrative and how much of a hero he was for solving that problem and injecting a lot of money into the economy. He did not want to talk about regulation. He did not want to talk about how he was wrong before and during about financial reform. It was not a topic he wanted to talk about. He writes a book, The Courage to Act. And his courage was to save and, unlike the Great Depression, have the central bank step in and flood the world with money, okay? That was his courage, to do that. He didn't have the courage to stop a dividend or to even talk to me.
So I just want to make one follow-up comment, which is, or to pose a question, which is that I'm interested in whether you or others agree with the proposition that the first best would actually be if the government had a lot less power, for example, to bail out these banks, or in the case, let's take the opioid example, which you gave, right? So Casey Mulligan has shown that most of the increase in spending on opioids was actually financed and paid for by Medicare and Medicaid. Yeah. So, you can view that as corporations corrupting government, but the fact that there was such tremendous stakes, money there with which to do that, trillions of dollars a year, I think one can ask the question as to whether that's maybe the fundamental problem. And if those stakes weren't there, if that wasn't up for grabs, then we would have fewer of these problems.
Okay, thanks for that question. What I mean to say is not about, size of government or, it's about doing the right things. Now, I don't know if there's a huge debate all the way to today, if the same person who wrote A Crisis Wasted was saying, oh, look at how beautiful they bailed out earlier in COVID. They should have bailed out before Lehman failed. That was the lesson some people learned. Let's do more bailouts, more bailouts, because the bailouts work and letting fail didn't work. Okay, so I don't know about central banks. We created them because people had panics and runs and all of that. But where they start stepping, and that's what in my new book, how they bail out everybody, including governments. Okay, that's the central bank. Okay, do you want to take away the central bank power? You'll be back in the free banking era where we couldn't trust the currency. Okay, so we need trustworthy currencies. We need trustworthy institution. What makes them trustworthy is that they are doing what they're supposed to do and not more. Kevin Walsh likes to talk about mission creep of the central bank and all kinds of things like that. I don't like, the government failed. In all these cases I'm talking about, it's the government failed, okay? But that doesn't mean to give it less power. It means to make it do the right thing. That's what I want.
Sarita?
Thank you so much. I read your paper really closely. I thought it was really interesting. And I think you do a fairly good job. I don't know if you meant to make this point because it's not made explicitly, but I think you were trying to make the case that if you are a free market capitalism advocate, there are good reasons for you to want regulation that is stronger or more effective, more efficient, et cetera, because the corruption of various different large-scale corporations distorts the market and harms people in a way that free market advocates would not like and would say is against the spirit of free market capitalism.
That's right. What I want, the word regulation is so hated, but you obviously want property rights and you want the government to protect those. So that we can all agree on. Then you want contract enforcement. So we like private contracts and we want somebody to adjudicate them. And, maybe it should be a court system with some transparency and all of that, as opposed to a private legal system and all of that. Then you get to the area in which, there's a lot of information asymmetry. Some people know more than others. Accounting standards, here we have some people in accounting, who decides the accounting standards? so sometimes it's private organizations that do these things. Okay, FASB is a private organization. Then you got the SEC, etc. So who protects investors? You know, are we okay with fraud? When you say free to what? You know, do we agree that they sell as a fraudulent product and we don't have any access to courts? So what all I'm saying is that the legal infrastructure that we're kind of taking for granted when we talk about these free market, because the freedom is to do all the, what's the limit of that freedom? It's obviously not the freedom to steal from somebody. So you want to be able to limit, you know, what any freedom is really ultimately about when it starts stepping into somebody's rights. So, you know, that's kind of what I'm saying now. In terms of the rules, I just say somebody sets them. If you don't like the government to set them, do you like what the private companies do? You know, they will say you can't sue me. Right now, if you go to the pharmacy and they give you a completely different medication than what you were prescribed, you can't go to court. You signed it. Okay, we agree to everything that we are asked to agree to. And we say we read it, all 40 pages of it. That's the way it is. Okay, what is an adhesive contract? Did we negotiate, or were we just told and all the companies are taking the same thing? Is that freedom of contract? It used to be in Germany that price fixing was not only legal. I mean, cartels, there was freedom of contract to agree on price fixing. So do we have, you know, a Sherman Act? Is that about efficiency? Is that about fairness? What does fair market mean? What does free market mean? So there are all kinds of words thrown around, the word freedom often.
I agree. Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to unpack. I was trying to unpack vocabulary, which is sort of what in banking I also encounters. What does this word mean, first of all? What are we talking about that we can begin to discuss?
Yeah. Along those lines, in a future iteration, I think I'd like a little bit more clarity on when you say trustworthy institutions, what institutions precisely are you talking about? And this is why Jeffrey, I think, was kind of confused at the beginning about the political institutions, because sometimes it's not clear if you're referring to federal institutions or private or state institutions and various other things. And there was kind of a broad democracy is being harmed, but if you're really talking primarily about even like the financial federal institutions, those are slightly separate from some of our other political institutions. So, and perhaps you're right, perhaps it infects them all, at least indirectly, but I would like to have a better sense of the trustworthiness of those institutions, what they are.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me explain what I mean by institutions. It's really all the above. An institution is, you know, could be an elected institution, could be an appointed institution, could be a corporation or a business. How do you trust anybody in any institution where you engage with them in a transaction? You buy their products, you work for them, and you know somehow they won't harm you. What protects you from their harm? Some contract, some government, some ability to fight back. Because if somebody has power over you, then you want you want to be able to trust them, even though there's a power differential. That's why I'm saying rules create trust. And that's why, you know, if you want to be a trustworthy institution, you want the government, you want to say, you know, I am going to pay you fairly because the government is going to make me do it. We go on the roads and trust that there won't be too many drunk drivers because there is laws against drunk driving. So we hope that the policemen will stop the drunk drivers before they hit us. And that's what Mothers Against Drunk Driving were lobbying for, is the standard for alcohol, the fact that we will all have to learn the standards so before we drive, and we will have harsh penalties if we are caught. And by the way, markets are also considered institutions. Markets are institutions. If you read the fathers of institution, Douglas North, things like that, they were saying markets are just the rules of society. Markets are everything. Media is media institutions. You know, they're composed of nonprofit, for-profit, elected at the state level, at the city level, everywhere you see institutions.
There are two questions, Richard and then John.
Yeah, Yvonne took my first question, but I have another one that I've actually been kind of wanting to ask you for a while. But this has this talk has a sort of very normative element of like, we ought to have better institutions, all that, right? Are we just, maybe we're thinking about this wrong? Like, I'll take the example of the banking regulations. Like, everyone who's an economist in this group knows what banking regulation should look like. You wrote it up. And we all get angry and bang our heads against the wall because nobody will do it. Maybe we're the ones being silly. Like, oh, look, this is good policy, you should adopt it, is a foolish exercise if we take what's going on seriously. It's like, no, if we want to be helpful, we need to say, this is some extremely greedy thing you could do that will eventually achieve that. So is that a approach you would?
No, it's just, the people with power will do what is in their interest. If you don't like it, you have to fight back. My frustration is that, most academics don't want to do it. And it's a crazy thing to do. And that's just depressing is what it is. Now, what I'm saying to you all is, we are all very privileged. I think all of us in this call. We don't have to worry about it. It's politics. We can sit here and talk about it. But, there is I'm a bleeding heart to the point that I think, there is injustice. I think the banking system, there's not just injustice, but inefficiency in this world. And that good people should do something about that, should try to improve policies, should try to create more trust in a system, should try to get along. I don't know.
Would it be more effective to, instead of solving for the best policy, solve for the thing that promotes someone's interest, but also improves policy at the margins?
I'll make bargains potentially, but I talk to anybody who will talk. I don't know. Obviously, you need to enter a serious negotiation right now. I don't think people are talking in good faith. People are advancing views if they can get away with that. That's my experience.
John?
Thanks. I get the sense that you're outraged, but not quite exactly at what. And I think it would be useful to, compartmentalize the discussion. There's a distrust in institutions. I think your discussion with Jeff was useful for us to say, well, there's corporations and there's government institutions. Let's leave lack of trust in the FBI off the table for right now. This is about corporations. I share your outrage at the failures of the Dodd-Frank Act and regulation, although whether that's due to evil corporations or whether that's due to,
No, I didn't say that.
Let me finish.
To the policy.
Okay. I don't like the policy either.
Yeah.
Then you went on to the Sacklers. I'm not quite sure what's so outrageous there. There was a demand for Medicare to provide opioids. There was a great movement in medicine that we have undertreated pain. We need to do pain. They ended up losing billions and billions of dollars. Maybe you wanted them to go to jail too and lose some more billions of dollars. But let's not have selection bias. Many other corporate executives and corporations are scared to death. The way the regulatory state works in the US, any number of alphabet soup agencies can send you a dear colleague letter and shut you down at a moment's notice. So the idea that the government isn't cracking down on corporations for one thing or another does not strike me to be the way the system works. Now they're cracking down on things that perhaps we would rather they didn't crack down on, and many things are made up, but that's not the world we live in. Corporations evolve. Limited liability corporations we have a very responsive democracy. And as problems came up, things happen. It's not like the Sacklers got off scot-free and there's regulatory changes. I think there is a common diagnosis of the problems that you talk about, which many of us agree with. Regulatory capture. When you have a legal and regulatory system set up, naturally the people in the business are incented to go try to set it up. And capture now works two ways. Politicians love this because they've captured the corporations. Once we have a regulatory system,
Yeah.
then we can enhance our political power by having the corporations do what we want.
Yeah.
The usual solution to that around here is less government, not more government.
What do you mean by less?
Let
Just
me
tell me what.
finish. It is the extreme amount of regulatory power that allows both the capture of those regulators and the capture of others. You use the word corruption. I sense outrage. You use the word corruption very freely. Corruption really means doing illegal things.
No. Corruption can be legal.
And let me finally, you finally got a little bit clear about you want protection from harm. But really, do we believe that lots of government regulation is the way of protecting consumers from harm? Most of the products we get are extraordinarily trustworthy. The computers we're looking on, the iPhones that we buy. Where does that trustworthiness come from? The discipline of competition, not the protections of the regulator.
I did not say I want a lot of regulation. When did I say that? I didn't say that. The Sacklers.
It's not clear what you want. And
it depends on the context, what you need. Okay. It depends if the markets are failing or not. I mean, look there's regulatory capture for sure. If you were to read about the Sacklers, you will know why they did get off scot-free and shouldn't have. Okay. It was a campaign of deception is what it was. Okay. It wasn't that they
They did not get off scot-free. They lost their whole business and billions of dollars. They didn't lose even more, but they did not get off scot-free.
Well, I mean, it depends what your benchmark is for they had a business that they didn't have to do what they did with, but did, and that business is now in bankruptcy. Okay, we can talk about the Sacklers. I mean, I would want you to, we can discuss this offline. Now, more or less government, corrupt government, I agree with a lot of it, but I do not agree right now that the government is going arbitrarily after corporations that have no power in the law, because what we're seeing now is a complete attack on agencies entirely. And I'm not in favor of all the different agencies, but I can tell you that very basic safety, and we're talking cyber safety, infrastructure safety, other things, is in great danger and fragility. And what happened in COVID with the PPEs and all of that required massive government intervention in a place where, why is the healthcare system in the US so crazy? It's not just Medicare. It's not just Medicare. It's about the fact that you go to the hospital and a private equity firm has hired the emergency room doctor that's not in your network, and you're in the hospital and you don't have time to check whether to deal with whether they're in your network or not, because you need care right there. That's a classic holdup problem.
That's a holdup problem that describes about 0.1% of American medical spending, but let's not get into.
Okay, but there's much else. Okay, read a book called Sickening. The book called Sickening is about medical knowledge and about pharma's control of medical knowledge. Okay, knowledge. I'm talking experiments. I'm talking trials, and control of medical journals too. Okay, so now on whose behalf? We have great medicines. Okay, we spend a lot of money in this country on healthcare, but it's not people in this university, lefties, want to start all over again. They say there's a social contract. We don't let people die in the streets in this country, so we're paying anyway. Might as well pay for prevention.
I'll go back to competition and too much government.
Yes. So who's going to enforce competition? How do you know?
The regulatory state enforces lack of competition. Almost all of it.
How do you? Okay, competition law is very tough. Competition law is very tough. How do you get competition to work? Do you believe we have it just because? Do you believe everything's fine on competition policy right now?
Okay, so there is a question, but
not my expertise. I don't know.
Vicente, maybe last two questions. Vicente, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much, Anat. And just to maybe intervene here in your conversation with John, I think something that I missed in the article and now in the talk is a distinction that has been made in the history of thought from very, very long ago, which is basically in kinds of law, right? One kind of law is private law, right? It's what the Greeks called nomos. It's basically like, protecting a private domain. And then other kinds of law is like magistrates, right? Decrees, it's rules aimed at specific outcomes, right? Aimed at specific kinds of people, kinds of corporations, and so on. And so I think, I think something that I missed in the article and what we've been talking is that, people have often, classical liberalism has, often, been very skeptical about coercion being strictly applied to like the first kind of law, like general abstract law, right? And trying to keep it away from like this more directed, aimed at certain, results kind of law. So I think I get what you mean when you say, there's no like a dichotomy between, big government and the free market capitalism. I think I get what you say, but then, I'm kind of like missing, the next step. Like, okay, is there then like a concern about the scope of government coercion, like or something of the sort?
I don't know how to do things. Okay, when you drive your car on the road, how much do you want to be private law versus government enforced? I mean, every context, it's sort of, what's the best way to organize an activity? And who should be the one setting the rules and enforcing the rules? Can we trust some kind of a private law to do everything? If somebody can, hit and run, is that okay? How can you chase them on your own? I mean, in other words, what's your limit of what you can do by yourself, and where do you need somebody to help you? That's all. These are big philosophical discussions. I had 5,000 words to answer about capitalism, okay, not about law. I introduced the law in there, okay, because I thought the problems are in the law somehow, okay. People said all kinds of things about capitalism in the volume, and you're welcome to go and read it, but I had 5,000 words, and that's what I chose to say.
Okay.
I mean, all of we can, the topics you allude to are big. I'm not a particular expert on all kinds of different ways of law, but, and on the, various philosophers of classical liberalism or others, but, I'm a new entrant into the legal field, and I try to get what I can out of this structure of the law, common law, civil law, whatever, that is evolved in every country.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anat, for a great presentation. Thank you, everyone, for a lively discussion. Our next speaker will be on September 28th, Melissa Kearney from the University of Maryland, and she will talk about how Americans stop getting married. So you're welcome to attend. Thank you again, Anat. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Anat.
Bye.